In my junior year in high school, I kind of had stopped really taking my faith personally seriously. I still went to church, still went to youth group. I invited friends to come to youth group. I was professing to know Christ, but I really wasn't reading the Bible. I really wasn't praying or doing anything to maintain a relationship with God. And I remember one day at school, me and my friends were sitting at lunch together in the cafeteria, and the conversation got on religion. And we were a really diverse group of people. There was every ethnicity you could think of was at that table. Pretty much any religion you could think of was at that table. And everybody started focusing on Christianity. And since I was the vocal Christian at the group, because I invited everybody to church regularly, they all started asking me questions. And I couldn't really answer them. And so I got really frustrated, and I threw all my stuff in my bag and I kind of huffed off from the table. I think I made a comment about how they were all ganging up on me and it wasn't fair. I was being a big baby. And as I left the cafeteria, I remember thinking the thoughts of, it was just no fair, they were teaming up on me, how could anybody answer all those questions coming from all the different angles at the same time? And as I left the kind of dim light of the cafeteria into the sunny day of our courtyard at school, I had a thought. And all I could say is that the thought couldn't have been from me, or at least I don't think it could have been from me. The thought was, no, you couldn't answer their questions because you don't really know me that well. And oh man, that really hit. That really hit my heart, because I realized that all these years, that since junior high, when I really first committed to Christ, that I had proclaimed to be a Christian, I really didn't do anything to get to know the Lord that I proclaimed. So from that day forward, for I think pretty much the rest of that school year, I sat in a corner of the school by myself just reading the Gospels and trying to understand what God was teaching me through his revelation. And I doubled down in youth group, and I started getting involved in student leadership in my youth group, and I even started teaching in my youth group. And those moments were significant for forming my faith and really helping me to learn what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus. Not just a proclamation of a faith, but something lived out, something where I really knew this Lord I proclaimed and had an ongoing conversation and relationship with him. The early church is a great place to go and learn how to do evangelism, because it was the early church who originally first shared the news of Jesus' death and resurrection, what it means for humanity, with the world. And so with the things that they say and the things that they do really help us to understand how we engage with the world. So we see three stories, or at least three snippets of stories in our scriptures this week. One with Philip and being called by the Spirit to go and minister to an Ethiopian eunuch. Another, Paul, using his connections to his Judaism to start first in the synagogue and reasoning with the Jews of whatever city he was in out of the scriptures. And then next was Peter being called by God to go and minister to a Roman centurion, and that centurion having faith and believing, and then God seeing that he was opening the kingdom to more than just the Jewish people, the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he was including the Gentiles into this new family, this new covenant in Jesus. So we can look at these stories and we can learn something for ourselves. And as we turn in our series away from how we understand our own stories and how we think about how we construct our stories, we turn towards the relationships that we might form with other people that would allow us to share those stories. And in the second half of the series, we're really going to focus on that. What does it mean to build relationships where we are trusted, where we are respected, and where we earn the right that people would want to listen to our stories? So this week, I want you to ask a few questions out of these stories from the book of Acts. The first thing I really want us to look at and think about is, who has God placed in your life? We often talk about stewardship as the management of your time, talents, and money. But I think we do a disservice by leaving out relationships, because I think the core of how God created us is to be relational, and the core of our responsibility and work in this world is in relationship with other people. And so it's kind of on us as the church to talk more about how we steward relationships God has given to us. Your family was not given to you by an accident. Your friends were not put into your life by accident. Your coworkers, your neighbors, These people who are in your life, I don't believe are there by accident. You were put in their lives and they were put in your lives for a purpose. And so who has God placed in your life? You need to do a little bit of an inventory. Think through all the different communities that you are a part of, whether it's a school board or PTA, or whether it's a soccer team, or whether it's a school that you attend, college or high school or elementary school, or whether it's your workplace. Whatever it is, do a little bit of an inventory and think through, who has God actually placed in my life? What are the most significant relationships? And what are those relationships where I feel a natural affinity and feel like this relationship is a great connection and I really like and respect this person? And those are the places that we should start in terms of building relationships that are worthy of being heard and sharing our story, and that we can listen to their stories. The next thing is to be open and humble. Think about Peter and Philip. They're both from Jewish background, and if they were not open and humble, they might refuse the Spirit's leading for them to go and speak to somebody who was outside of the Old Testament covenant. They might think, God, I don't want to go talk to that eunuch, or I don't want to go talk to that centurion. They're the ones persecuting many of my friends. And they're the ones who murdered Jesus, my master, my Lord. And so the fact that they were open and willing to be called by the Spirit to listen and to obey whatever the Spirit's calling was, and in fact that they were humble and didn't make judgments, but instead were open towards the people that God was calling them into relationship with, allowed for there to be that bridge and that connection. In your relationship with other people in your life, if you're not open and humble towards them, then you will not earn the right to be heard. If you're seen as arrogant or too good or anything like that, they're not going to hear your story. They're not going to care about your story because you haven't clearly cared about them. The third thing, I think, is something that we need to think about in modern day culture. Oftentimes we get stuck in our little circles, especially get stuck into circles in our churches where the only people we hang out with are other Christians. And that's not a bad thing. We're the body, so we're supposed to be built up together and encourage one another and be in relationship with each other. But if we only ever hang around other Christians, then how are we the salt and the light to the rest of the world? How do we influence people? How do we love people? How do we serve people that aren't in the church? So we kind of have to somehow break out of our bubbles, break out of our church walls, and go into the spaces where other people are and get to know them. And here's a little trick that you can take with you. Use your natural interests. You see, Paul knew that when he entered into a city, the first place he would go was to the Jewish synagogue, because Paul was a Jewish man and Paul loved the Jewish people. At one point in Romans, he says he would cut himself off from Christ if it meant that they would come to know him. And so Paul started in a place that was natural in his interest. He started with the Jews and reasoned with them from scriptures. But you have other interests. Maybe you're really, really into baseball. And so maybe you join a club of people who are really into your baseball team that meets and watches games together so that you can get to know people who aren't in your Christian bubble. Maybe you love knitting, and so you get involved in a knitting club. Maybe you really love movies, and so you use one of those websites that are out there that helps people with similar interests get together, and you find other people who love the kind of movies you do, and you go to movies together. Or any other interest or natural thing that you find appealing, you can start on a same ground of footing with the other person because you both enjoy the thing that you are being a part of. And you can use that to build trust and build relationship and build authenticity with one another so that when the time comes, they might be willing to listen to your story. The last thing is probably the most important thing. You need to be willing to learn from them. I know this might be hard for Christians to hear. Sometimes it's hard for me to hear, but we don't have the corner on truth. And we also don't have the corner on experiences with God or God moving in our lives. We see throughout the entirety of scriptures God moving in the lives of people who were not a part of the promised covenant and who were not faithfully obeying him. And yet they encountered him nonetheless, or they had some kind of truth from him in some way or another. So as we are in relationships with other people, we should never see ourselves as in the position of power or authority or privilege or anything like that. We're a human just like they're human. And the point of the cross is that we're all at the foot of the cross. The point of the communion table is we're all invited to sit around the table together. And so whether they've professed Christ or not, they might have had experiences that might teach you something about your faith. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with good friends of mine who aren't Christians, and I've learned something about life, about truth, about beauty, about faith from them that I would have never have known if I wasn't listening to them and willing to learn from them. So we need to go into these relationships with not just some kind of goal to mark a notch on our belt of another person we've converted, but to truly care in mutual equality with the other person, so that when the time comes, you could share your story, but also you're open to listen to their story, because you never know what they might have to teach you in your faith. So if we remember these things from these stories and these pointers that we get from these stories in Acts, that we need to think about who God has placed in our life. We need to be open and humble towards them. We need to use our natural interests to sometimes get us out of our bubbles that we've created and get to know people who aren't in the church or aren't in our little bubble. And we need to be willing to learn from the people that we are loving and in relationship with, regardless of their status as a Christian. And in these things, as you build a relationship with somebody in this way, when the time comes, if God opens the door, then they'll be willing to listen to your story, because they'll know that you care for them, you love them, and they'll want to know something about your story.